Welcome everyone and Happy New Year. My name is Elias Papaioannou and I serve as the Academic Director of London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. The Wheeler Institute was funded with a generous gift from Tony and Maureen Wheeler, founders of Lonely Planet, that have shown the beauties of developing world and our beautiful planet. And Tony and Maureen are passionate about the role of business and development more generally. Among funding academic research and promoting teaching, mostly in low-income countries, the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development organizes every year a flagship event. This is going to be our third flagship event on Rethinking Capitalism. And I couldn't be more glad and happy and honored to welcome Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. Esther and Abhijit, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
I don't think that Esther and Abhijit need much of an introduction, especially given the discussion that we plan having today. Esther and Abhijit, alongside with Michael Kramer, have put forward and have developed a very innovative new approach to tackle some of the world's more profound impact. And for their contribution in poverty alleviation, they were awarded last year the Nobel Prize in economics. I strongly recommend, if you have not done so, to read their excellent book, Poor Economics, which actually builds on a Journal of Economic Perspectives article on the economic lives of the poor, which I think is a sine qua non reading if we want to understand the development more generally. More recently, Esther and Abhijit have written another excellent book, which I have here, Good Economics for Hard Times, which I think it was released last year. Actually, I remember like 1 week, I think, after the Nobel Prize announcement. But actually, it couldn't be more topical given what's happening in the world economy in developing countries, and more specifically nowadays with COVID-19. So without much, let's not lose much more time and go to our discussion. Actually, before I do that, let me make two remarks. Actually, Esther has been awarded an honorary doctorate from the London Business School a couple of years ago. So we're very honored, Esther, to be part of the wider London Business School community. And I would say on a personal note that I was very honored last year to co-teach with Abhijit at MIT during my sabbatical. So I want to start our discussion today with a question of what's happening nowadays in developing countries. Most of us read in the news what's happening in the US, in the UK, with the chaos, with immunization in Europe. But can you give us, and let's start our discussion with an overview of what's happening. I know, Abhijit, you have been working in India, Esther, you have been working in many settings. What's happening nowadays health-wise and economic-wise in frontier and low-income countries?
In terms of COVID, interestingly, I think as of now, the death rates are very, very significantly lower in low-income countries than in the West, and that's almost unique in terms of such global events. So it's and I don't think anybody has any idea of why. You have some hypothesis. I mean, that, for example, it's a younger population, or that it's a population that's more exposed to diseases, so it has more resistance, or that it has, there's some particular vaccine that children get in. But I think none of those stories fully explain what happened, because in fact the infection rate went up quite high and then fell. And so all these explanations would suggest that there would be some, it could be level could be low, but in fact you see a very steep rise and a steep fall as well. And that's certainly somewhat puzzling, and I don't think anybody has a credible explanation of what happened. So that's all. Now, given that, the economic reaction was probably, in retrospect, maybe an overreaction, in the sense that there was, in several countries, including India, the economy was completely shut down. Schools are still essentially closed. After 10 months, schools are closed. So that's a huge amount of learning loss. So there's been a series of actions which, in retrospect, look more extreme than they might have been. But I also would say that this is 2020 hindsight, because it's not, we didn't know this. We didn't know what's going to happen. So I don't blame people from taking hardline decisions, but the consequence of that I think, highlights the rigidities inside the economy. So, when something like this are really, I think India had a very well enforced lockdown, and GDP fell quarter on quarter by 24%. That's a number that's almost unthinkable. It suggests an economy where there is just very few margins of adjustment. When you stop certain activities, things just freeze and nothing comes in its place. And then the question is, could the government have done more to anticipate that and support that? And one thing we know is, and this is a number from the IMF, which is that the amount of support that the governments plowed into the Western economies is massively higher. So if you look at that number, it's 20% of GDP in the rich countries, 6% in the kind of the middle income countries, and 2% in the poor countries. And that just means that you don't have much of a macroeconomic pushback against what the government, the policy has done, and as a result, the economy went into free fall. It's going to be interesting to see how long it takes to recover, but it's certainly a concern, across many countries, that we were going to be. I think people have numbers on just how much poverty has gone up. I think some of those numbers are, I think, based on possibly, poverty went up, but of course it could go back down very quickly. The question is not so much did at any one point of time poverty climb up a lot, but whether that's going to be, how sticky it's going to be, or will the economic well-being return very fast? And that's where I think a lot of the speculation is now.
I like this optimism that although poverty has been going up, it can quickly go down. So Esther, do you share this optimism?
Well, starting with what we know about the recovery so far is not only we know that some countries' fall in GDP has been precipitous. So for India, it's the lowest recorded in the world. It probably was also, so this 24% decline in GDP, it's always like the worst we've seen. That said, perhaps GDP is not very well measured in other African countries where it might just have been just as high. On average, according to what the IMF calculated, the fall in GDP was actually similar, around 6% for the beginning of 2020. But what is striking is that the recovery was not similar. And the richer China, if you remove China, the emerging and poor economies, except for China, have recovered much less than the richer countries. So if that continues in the same way, the fear is that they will recover less than the richer country. And that's related to this point about them not having simply the ability to borrow enough to do the whatever it takes that European likes to do and have been able to do in this case. And I honestly think that whatever it takes was the right approach. In both when Mario Draghi first said it and more relevant in the current context, not only to make the pain less acute during the crisis, but also to lay out the foundation for a recovery. So for example, in Europe, people were able to keep their employees. So the moment that the economy reopened, even temporarily, it turns out in the summer, people were able to go back and start working and consuming. In a country like India, for example, even when the number of cases went down, when the lockdown were lifted, people feel and are very poor. So it is not that I can immediately rush and start spending again and in this way restarted the economy. So I think that it is completely possible to get a restart in those poor economies because it came from the sky. Like the economy they had their own issues, but they didn't collapse on the weight of these issues,
Sure.
which is different from the typical crisis. But it will require action to help them manage this transition. So I think there is a lot that can be done and should be done now.
Sure, and actually, if I was to use as the last crisis as an example, the 2008, 2010, 11 crisis, again, emerging and low-income countries were affected, but then there was some quick rebound, precisely, I think, for the reasons that you mentioned. And I think one issue that I think you raised, which I think is very topical, is now vaccination proceeds slower, or in some other countries a bit faster in the advanced economies, but then many low-income countries still have not started the process, which means that it is not unthinkable to see a rebound in Western Europe, the UK, and the US, but not so much in low-income countries. And I refer here to 2021. But on what should be done, I read again your piece at The Economist. If I'm not mistaken, it was in May. Actually, The Economist, every year in December, they would send the most widely read articles, and it was featured yours. And recently in Le Monde, you had actually an update of this piece that effectively you are calling for a new Marshall Plan. And actually coming from a country, Greece, that has benefited from the Marshall Plan. We will have the left-leaning government of Syriza in the past years actually calling for an EU Marshall Plan for the periphery. Actually, I'm very intrigued by your proposal. So can you give us some details, please?
Go ahead.
Well, the analogy to the Marshall Plan is the analogy of post-war recovery. And one thing that was striking after the war is a fairly, actually quite quick rebound of economies that were even profoundly affected. So you're looking at Japan, you're looking at Germany, and towns that were entirely leveled picked up quickly and at a rapid growth rate. So they kind of went back to wherever they would have been in a relatively short amount of time. And one thing that made that possible is the Marshall Plan, which is the original investment that allowed people to get the economy humming again. So in May, we were calling for the Marshall Plan for the poor country to make that possible. Because precisely, although we didn't have the number then, we anticipated something like what happened in reality, which is the poor country being unable to borrow in order to mitigate the short-run effect of the crisis, and then kind of overcome them as soon as the health conditions were possible. And nothing remotely like that happened. But then it was May, and in a way, we were, too early for our times. It is pretty clear that in May, rich countries were completely obsessed by their own issues, which, were severe, to be fair, and nobody was ready for that. Now, I think so the reason why we kind of went back at it at the end of 2020 in Le Monde is we felt, look, now that we see vaccination coming along, now that we see the end of the tunnel for us, is the right time to put back this idea. The Marshall Plan actually was, people started thinking about it at the end of the war, started thinking about reconstruction effort towards the end of the war, and it was launched shortly after the war was finished. So it's a little bit here, the same thing is kind of helping this process. And maybe I can have Abhijit. Abhijit can continue on what we think are the elements that you want in a Marshall Plan.
Please, Abhijit, I see that you listed 3 priorities. Perhaps you want to tell us and a bit elaborate on those.
I think you should go ahead.
So the first one is vaccination. That seems clear, you mentioned it. So a country like India is able to start their own vaccination program, partly because India is the pharmacy of the world. So if someone can manufacture vaccines, that's India. In the rest of the world, at the current pace, it is estimated that Africa would finish vaccinating their population in like 80 years or something like that. And that's crazy. It's just, it can't happen. First of all, because that's a ethical just nightmare that we would allow an entire continent to go without those vaccinations that are life savings. Second of all, because it just wouldn't make any sense from the point of view of Europe. Because as long as vaccination is not mandatory in Europe, and therefore far from universal, if it's in Africa, it's in Europe. It's basically it's not even in question. If it's in Africa in a large number, it is going to come back via the share of people who choose not to get vaccinated in Europe or in the US. So it's absolutely necessary that we vaccinate. If a particular country is not willing to vaccinate their entire population, they have to be, for their own self-interest, from the purely health point of view, wanting to vaccinate as many people as possible in the world. And yet, despite that, there is a group, the ACT Accelerator, that is kind of coordinating the purchase of vaccines for the developing countries, and it has a huge shortfall. The UK, actually, I should say, is one of the leaders in the funding of this group. So the UK is doing well, but the UK is not going to do this entire effort on their own. So the contribution of the EU as a group has been fairly low so far. The contribution of individual countries has been fairly low. So that's definitely the first thing. The second thing is the economic pillar. And there it's, how do you help kickstarting the economies? Like what can you do now, even if we didn't do it before, to help poor countries relaunch? And that's when you, I think, don't need to be shy, spending money, and basically spending money on the poor country the same way that we spend money on ourselves, which is basically via direct transfer to people. So in Europe, in the US, they are targeted via the unemployment system or via furlough. In developing countries, they could, particularly in the poorest, they could be made simpler via temporary cash transfer on a universal basis, just to help people start consuming, producing, etc., so the economy can be restarted. And the third pillar is that of innovation, because the pandemic has revealed so much new problems. I mean, there are always new problems, but there are even newer problems here. Like, for example, how do you vaccinate 1 billion people in India? That's kind of a new problem. They haven't had, they're doing polio every year, but that's a different one with the condition of a vaccine. How do you deal with education when kids have been out of schools for months, and so on and so forth? And for that, we need to be willing to find new solution, test a new solution, roll out that works, etc. And with those three, we could, as a world, go out of the crisis much faster.
Sure. So, which brings me actually to my next question, which regards more broadly your research and your important work in the past 2 decades. Given all what we know from randomized controlled trials, also from policy experiments like the one on school construction that you have worked in Indonesia, what do you think should be the priorities now? Can you come up with a couple of micro and perhaps more macroist kind of interventions that low-income countries need? And for example, Abhijit, I have a question also for you, given your work on universal basic income in developing world. What does the evidence show? Could this be a good idea nowadays?
So I think that both the I think both the evidence and I think the what Esther said about the macroeconomic situation in these countries point to, I think, the first priority, I think, needs to be just a restart of the economies and vaccination. I think restarting the schools, vaccinating, and restarting the economies are, there's nothing else that's first order relative to that. I think they're sort of, I think schools have been closed in many countries now for almost a year, and that's we know that's from Esther's work that you mentioned in Indonesia. We know that's 7% of your income for the rest of your life. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. I mean, just think of that as a proportion of GDP. That's a lot of money that people lost. And I think that just the order of magnitude of keeping the economies even half closed, given we know how rigid things are, is also extremely costly. So I think the vaccination is both sort of a moral necessity, but also just to create comfort in the population. It's critical that we have people being vaccinated, because I think that's where it's still true that people are just nervous to travel. For example, in India, one of the issues that came up and is still remain very salient is, when the lockdown happened, it happened within a few hours, 4 hours, which was little maybe extreme. And as a result, what happened was that a lot of people were stranded. And they were stranded in places where the entire welfare system was unable to process them. They didn't exist for the welfare system. The welfare system is localized in specific ways. So they didn't exist. So they were starving. Literally, very quickly they were starving. And then they walked back. For a while, the government was very reluctant to run trains for very, very obvious reasons. The right policy would have been to find just everybody and just hand out cash to them. That would have been much better than what happened was that they took the diseases back to their districts as a result. What happens next is that they're scared and they don't want to go back. We talked to some business people. They say we don't get in Pune, where the economy is now back to being relatively lively, we just can't get workers anymore. Because they came from all over the country and they're in their villages and they're worried that there'll be another lockdown. So I think the general sense of, we are on top of COVID is extremely important. Right? That vaccination is going to be part of that story. But also, I think the sense of, we are going to, this time we know what to do and we're going to, manage your economic needs as maybe, it's going to be critical to reopening the economy. So I think these pieces of, and the education piece of it, I think that's almost, that's the most unfortunate because there isn't much evidence that schools are a major hub of transmission. So especially primary schools are open in France. There doesn't seem to be any particular feeling that that's the major source of transmission. And I think Pakistan opened its schools a while ago and they seem to be doing okay. The infection rate has gone up a little, but still not. So I do think that there is a sense in which, but for example, in a lot of countries in Africa, the schools are still closed. While, you could maybe in France or in the US, you can get classes on Zoom. This is not about to be the big part of any story in India. So that sort of, it's very clear that that's the landscape. And within that, I think one of the things we've learned over the last many years is that if the education system really needs to take cognizance of the fact that people are lost learning for a long time. There's both evidence, clear evidence that just the summer causes learning losses. So this is going to create massive learning losses. The question is, do you now treat these kids as being just backward students in their grades and teach the grade curriculum or not? And we've been arguing for many years now that you want to teach what kids learn to know, not what you want them to know. And I think that particular distinction has become extraordinarily critical in this context, because if you don't teach kids, help them catch up, then they'll all drop out. And then we'll get the really catastrophic, it would be not 1 year of learning loss, it'll be 5 years of learning loss. So I think that we're really sitting on the cusp of that, which is the decision to how to transition these children back into the school system. And that's going to be another place where the intervention needs to be tailored to the problem, or else we could quote disaster.
So if I was to sum up, the first would be dealing with the pandemic with vaccination and health. The second should be tackling the education gap that you discussed there right now, Abhijit. But Esther, I also saw, following the developments in France, that President Macron set up a development innovation fund for development and inequality. I'll come back to the relation between the two, that you kindly agreed to chair. There have been some money put forward, my understanding, from the French administration. You also mentioned the UK. So I have a dual question. First, what will this fund do in the short and more likely in the medium run? Because these problems will not go away in 2021 or 2022. And second, do you see that the way forward is those unilateral kind of approaches, or we need something much bolder multinational? For example, on the issue that Abhijit just mentioned, At the Wheeler Institute, I hosted in May our friend Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, who they have put forward a bold proposal to restructure mostly emerging markets debt. So what is the way forward for development policy more generally?
That's a great question. So the answer to whether that's the answer to all of the world's problem is definitely no. It's a small part of an answer. It's meant to address the third pillar that I was talking about, which is the innovation pillar. And it's been generously funded by the French government, but still at a level that is small, even relative to the budget of even the French aid budget. So it's not meant to substitute to what exists now. What it is meant to do is to help countries to develop their own innovative solution, test them out, and scale them. And it's not the first of its kind. In the US, there is DIV, the Development Impact Venture, that was started by USAID under Michael Kramer's leadership. In the UK, there is GIF, the Global Innovation Fund, that was funded as a sort of joint venture between USAID and the then DFID. But there was nothing like that in continental Europe, and the French DIV is sort of filling that gap, and also filling that gap towards countries that have been completely left out of this type of innovation movement, in particular the Sahel and countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So the reason why it can matter is to go back to the question of vaccination, for example. I was chuckling the other day because on my run I was listening to someone describing the vaccination campaign in the US and the many problems that it has, and contrasting the fact that it was developed, the scientific process that led to its quick development was just magnificent, and now we are kind of unable to get it in a number large enough into people's arms. The US is not at all alone in facing this difficulty, by the way. And someone said, oh, you don't get, this is all about logistics. You don't get a Nobel Prize for logistics. And as I was running, I was like, yes, you do. That's why we got the Nobel Prize. It's for this, what we've been calling plumbing, which is that most of the difference between success and failure is not only how much money there is. I think in this case we do need some money for sure, but also how you organize the details of the rollout of a particular policy. And this is particularly obvious in the case of vaccination because it's something new and all of the countries are stumbling, including the rich countries. It's of course going to be difficult for the poor countries as well, although there have been successes of the Ebola fight against Ebola was a remarkable success that was in very, very poor countries. But we can expect issues in rolling out the vaccinations. And there again, you think, getting this plumbing done correctly will actually require just as much ingenuity as developing the vaccine itself. And this ingenuity exists, it's present in the countries, and there is no doubt a huge desire to do this right. But it will require a little bit of help and the ability for countries to learn from each other and to learn from experience and to know what has worked and what has not worked, and to share lessons on what has worked and scale that up. And this is where a fund like DIV is supposed to help, which is both financing innovation efforts to develop new policies in health, in gender, in the environment, in education, where we are going to need all of this innovation in droves, and find out whether they work through randomized controlled trials in particular. And then if they work, promote their adoption in neighboring countries elsewhere in the world, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. We are getting also many questions. We'll open the floor for questions in 5-10 minutes. But actually, I have a follow-up question here that, for example, Janice Cranston is a former LBS PhD student in finance, is asking, So there are two concerns already in the comments. First, how funding will be secured? And second, how about corruption or institutional deficiencies that, for example, the social allowances will end up in the pockets of those who do not necessarily deserve them. So I'm getting a lot of questions in this regard, but I think they are topical because they touch two issues that you also discuss in your book, funding, and in your piece, and foreign aid. And secondly, true, if countries such as European countries face problems in allocating those funds, this problem is way more severe in countries, for example, like Mozambique.
I think that's true and it's not true, in the sense that I think part of what we argue in the book is that these are countries where you want to simplify ex ante. You want to have policies that don't require a lot of targeting. So I think all the evidence from I think on targeting and on delivering public subsidies, I think we know that the more sophisticated the targeting scheme is, the more subject to gaming it becomes. Conversely, if you make it relatively straightforward, for example, everybody gets it. Not everybody will collect, actually. If you make it, not trivial to collect, you have to stand in line and get it or something. But I don't think that it's that hard to do it. Especially in many African countries, interestingly, one thing that's developed is the phone-based cash transfers. And almost every household has a phone, and almost every household could be therefore sent. I mean, you will certainly do a lot of, there will be a lot of complaints at the margin about who gets too much or not. But if you said essentially every household, every address will be geolocated to a phone number, and to that phone number will send you a certain number of dollars or whatever shillings, you would get a lot of the targeting resolved. It's precisely the fact that in poor countries, in a sense, the losses from mistargeting are much smaller, because many people, even the people who are not the poorest, are pretty poor. And if they got some extra dollars, and we think of the world welfare function, I would say it makes no difference. There's $2 a day, $1 a day, $0.50 a day. Who cares? At some level, all of them are poor. And so I do feel that at some level, therefore, the problem is in many ways easier than in a country where you might think that there are a lot of people who are well enough off that you don't need to intervene. So I think that's, and a small amount of money, given how poor these people are, a very small amount of money will make a very big difference. So in that sense, I feel that we're not talking about giving everybody $2,000 a week. We're talking about giving everybody $20 a week at most, and that's a lot actually in many countries. So it's even $5 a week would be a lot in many countries. So I think that the amount of money is small. You could give it to a lot of people. If the rich countries actually step forward with a certain amount of money, they wouldn't notice the amount of money that's spent while increasing welfare very widely. So in that sense, I do believe that the problem, it's easy to get frozen into this question. Of course, there'll be corruption. Of course, I'm going to put my cousin on the list of people who get it. But if the list is essentially everybody, then there's less incentive to do that. I do feel that that's, to me, the greatest attraction of a universal basic income is not its moral claims of not being judgmental, which I also support, but I think, just the practical experience of trying to target finely, which I think turns out to be often a disaster.
Can I add just one on your financing question?
Sure.
So in normal times, actually, we vastly overestimate how much poor countries rely on the generosity of rich countries. Aid is like a small fraction of most developing countries' budget, even very poor countries. It's only tiny countries that are very poor and that have strong relationship with the former colonial power, that aid is quantitatively important in the budget.
And then it's 15%.
And then it's 15%. So it's 50%. Like, so I think in normal time we totally exaggerate the role of aid. In fact, so for normal time, aid is, especially from the traditional rich country like Europe, the UK, or the US, is quickly barreling toward irrelevance. It's neither good nor bad. It's sort of inexistent. So, but we are not in normal times. We are in times where the rich countries had felt the need, rightly, to borrow tons and tons, trillions of euros and dollars and pounds to sustain themselves. So they borrow against the future, which they can do. The interest rate is almost zero, and that's it. This is clearly the right thing to do. But the poor countries don't have access to this borrowing. If you're Togo, there is no way you can go on the international market to do the same thing. So it is the time where basically the rich country need to add an epsilon on the amount that they are borrowing for themselves to borrow on behalf of the poor, because the poor can't do it. They just don't have the scope to do it. And so I think the financing question is very, is not genuine in the circumstance we are in, because after all, we don't feel any financing problem for ourselves. So in the same way, this is how we have to think about it. It's very much the same thing that we borrow as governments, because we know that mom and pop cannot borrow on behalf of themselves. In the same way, we should borrow as the EU or as the UK, because the government of Togo, who is perfectly capable of spending money on its citizens and has proven it through establishing within weeks a beautiful cash transfer through the telephones, isn't able to borrow to fund it. So this is how we have to think about the financing, knowing that in the same way that we are not going to support restaurants forever in Paris, because at some point they're going to reopen. We won't need to support Togo forever for their cash transfer system, because they'll go back to finance it for themselves.
They do have to open in order to enjoy a nice French bistro. But I see from your point, Abhijit, that simplicity pays off, especially given the the high levels of poverty. Second, and Esther points out, interest rates are at record lows. If anything, I would add, Esther, to your point that the market tends to want, for example, even the IMF or the EU as an entity to borrow internationally from the international capital markets, and this offers a unique opportunity, as you point out, to assist. Now, before I go to the questions from the audience, and I'm getting many questions, thanks a lot. I have a follow-up question which also relates very strongly to the Wheeler Institute. What's the role of business here? I understand that business cannot do much nowadays because they are closed and they have to be closed. But what's the role of business more generally in entrepreneurship in low-income countries in the years to come?
I think that one of the things that goes back to a question that Esther, or a point that Esther was making before, which is that if we think that the vaccination will be done by the very limited health infrastructure that exists, I think then we are looking for a very long, 80 years is the number she mentioned. I think that one of the things that we could easily do is involve private businesses. They have, many of them have very long arms. They exist in many places. Why couldn't they provide the infrastructure for, vaccinating people? I think that this is after all, this, if you had to signal that you are, you are corporate, you take your responsibility seriously as a corporate. Why this seems like an obvious place to step up and to say, look, we will provide, maybe there has to be some protocol that is respected so that people are assured that the vaccine is actually, but even there, I think there are corporates who have good enough reputation. Amazon will deliver your package almost anywhere, but why aren't they stepping up to say we can also send vaccinators somewhere? I really do feel that this is a global challenge, and one that if we actually demonstrated that if the corporates took the opportunity to demonstrate their real commitment to the global welfare, I think this would pay off even for them for the long run. I think they are all under pressure. There is a lot of political bile that's sloshing around against them, especially against the big corporates. I feel this is an opportunity. They should just see it as an opportunity to step forward and say, look, we'll take care of the entire supply chain down to this part of Togo, where we are, after all, we are buying our whatever vegetables there or something there. Why can't I do the other way around? Why can't I get the vaccination? We'll support it. Let's write it off as our cost for the year, from our cost for the years. But it's going to be such a wonderful affirmation of your corporate social responsibility.
Sure. So actually, let me open the floor and we have received many questions. So thanks all of you for taking the time. So one question I'm getting from my friend, actually, Sebastian Hohmann and many others, is about vaccines, trust in vaccines, and in particular, trust in vaccines in developing countries. And I know that Abhijit, you have been involved, and Esther, in a nice experiment in India. And also relate to that, I get two questions about you mentioned also in your piece that it's going to be important for the Rich Club of Nations to support developing countries on vaccines, but typically these are going to be like the not particularly effective vaccines. So there are some questions about ethics there. Can you comment on that?
I mean, I feel that right now we don't know that these other vaccines. I think going back to the question of getting reliable data, measuring innovations, etc. I don't know that we know that. I mean, one of the things that's been shocking to me is that the AstraZeneca vaccine rollout was so mishandled. It was like, why is this data look like that? And because it's possible that it has very high efficacy rates. It's just they don't seem to know. So, and certainly it's a very cheap vaccine. And likewise, I mean, I think the noise created by the Chinese vaccine that was originally 65% effective, but turned out to be only 50% effective. These things undermine confidence. So I do think I would have thought that rather than a global competition for showing who's best, there would have been this is a place where the externalities are largely negative. Every vaccine that sort of overclaims is a negative externality on all the other vaccines. So I want to say two things there. I want to say that it is not obvious to me that these vaccines have to be lower efficacy. It's true that the most expensive vaccines, in fact, those are the vaccines that are not available to the poor countries, and the poor countries have not just know that they can't afford them, so they haven't been getting in the market for the two most expensive. The mRNA vaccines are just off the market, and that has in the long run, I think we're going to start asking questions over the morality of what happened there. But right now, I think people have just recognized the reality, which is that we don't have the money for those. Those cost $30 per head, and we don't have the money for that. So we're really now talking about a bunch of either the Chinese vaccines, the Indian vaccines, AstraZeneca. There are a few vaccines that seem to be close enough to the threshold, and then whether they are, and again I would say that if the vaccination is high enough, then a 75% efficacy is good enough, because you get herd immunity very fast. It's precisely therefore that if the vaccine is not very effective, we need extremely high compliance. That's the trade-off. Because high compliance is a substitute for the effectiveness of the vaccine. If everybody is vaccinated, then you get herd immunity, and only 25% of them fail. You get herd immunity pretty fast. So I do think that that's the way we should think about it, is that we should therefore invest even more in compliance. Especially if we are troubled by the fact that these vaccines are not superbly effective, even a 50% effective vaccine, WHO admits them. And they admits them because with enough coverage, you can get herd immunity even with a 50% effective vaccine.
Yeah, and if I was to add, back in May, all the forecasts said that if the vaccine would be 75% efficient, even the mRNA ones, it would be a success. So
yeah, exactly.
And there are several. There are really a lot of vaccines coming down the pike, maybe in the dozens.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit partly because the research is warped toward the interest of the rich country. There has been so much focus on the mRNA vaccine because they given the technology, they could be developed very quickly. And but at the same time, including in the US and in Europe, other labs started working on other vaccines that have properties that make them better for developing countries. One of them is cost, and the other is that they don't require to be at sub-zero. The Pfizer vaccine, even if it could be purchased, is of no use for most developing countries because it could work in some parts, but not everywhere, because maintaining that cold chain is so difficult. So I think, given that nobody seems to be rushing to giving people, giving developing countries tons of money to buying the vaccine, the fact that these next lines of vaccines are going to come in the next few weeks is not going to be the constraining factor. So I don't think we should get paralyzed by that. We should give, meaning the world, should give a ton of money to ACT accelerator and allow countries to pre-buy doses of this series of vaccine. Many of them are well conceived for the problems there. On the trust issues, I honestly don't think the trust issue is any worse in developing countries than in developed countries. We don't have that much data yet on developing countries. We certainly do have data for France, where it used to be that less than 60% of people were willing to get vaccinated. This is increasing recently, probably as it becomes harder to get. People think that it's something that you should really have. We don't have those numbers for developing countries, but there is another factor to take into account, and that's related to this plumbing logistical issue. Is the even if you're perfectly willing to do it, you still have to be able to do it and to remember to do it. And this is where Abhijit and I have done a lot of research over the years on standard childhood vaccinations in India, where we've seen that 98% of parents absolutely intend to get their kids vaccinated. But less than half, substantially less than half, like 35%, get around to actually finishing the course and get their kids the measles vaccine. And of those, only about 27% within the first year of life, which is what it should be. And so we need to keep that into consideration as well. And there, of course, is the sheer availability. There has to be availability of the vaccine. But for that, countries have made a lot of progress, and presumably they're going to do the same for COVID, where vaccines are basically largely available.
And Gavi has made a lot of progress.
And so it's available very close to people. The nurses, there are mobile camps coming to people's villages. But after that, people aren't doing. It's not a last mile problem. It's literally a last meter problem. And that last meter problem is not one of trust primarily. It's one of full understanding of what vaccination is and how many doses you need for what, which is going to be an issue in the COVID vaccine because it takes 2 doses. And it's also a matter of having many, many other competing priorities. And there we've done research on how to kind of put it back. We and others have done research on how to put it back at the top of the mind, which could be helpful in this context as well.
Sure. So let me ask another question, which is more, I guess, medium to long run. I'm getting a couple of questions on that, among others by Julian. So many people stress rising inequality also in developing countries. Thanks to the work of Piketty and Saez, we know about the trends in the rich club of nations. There seems to be now more and more evidence from low income in developing countries. So the questions I'm getting is, how about if low income countries recover at some point, hopefully sooner than later, but then this recovery is very unequal? Because, for example, some kids, going back to the issue you discussed before, Abhijit, do manage to send their kids in some school or some private tutor, and therefore the gaps that we see continue rising. And the question I'm getting is, what would be the appropriate policies given your earlier work on development policy? Again, people keep mentioning the universal basic income and welfare policy more generally.
I mean, I think that would universal basic income as we conceive of it, given the fiscal capacity of these governments, do very much to inequality? No. I think the structural forces that you mentioned, in particular in this pandemic, the amount of the educational gap, but also just the fact that the markets are more and more winner take all. The markets are more integrated. The ones who happen to be in the right place are the returns are higher and higher. All of the global forces that are essentially working everywhere are also working there. So I think that universal basic income is going to be important in dealing with some sharing of the proceeds of growth. Yes. Do I think it's going to really make a dent on the inequality numbers? No. I think if we want to tackle inequality, we really need to do it head on, meaning much higher taxes, wealth taxes, estate taxes. Most countries, I think under the influence of a particular ideology coming from the West, have moved very much in the opposite direction. So I really think that I think we could pretend that we're going to fix this with universal basic income, but I don't think the fiscal capacity of the state right now is anywhere near doing that. I think, and there are competing claims. There's education to be funded, there's roads to be built, there's cities to be expanded. It's just not likely that till we solve the fiscal problem, that these countries raise their tax capacity, that we're going to get anywhere close to redistributing as much as we need to. I think inequality, sadly, I believe, will keep growing until the fiscal capacity is much higher. That's my rather, I guess, I'm depressed to have to say that, but I believe it.
Sure. So actually, I had promised my academic co-director of the Wheeler Institute, Rajesh Chandy, who is doing a lot of RCT work on marketing, to ask a question on his behalf. If you were to advise young economists, and he wants to think about economics broadly defined, like at the London Business School, have a PhD program in marketing, in entrepreneurship, in management, what would be your advice? What should be the topics that he or she should work on, again, in the development sphere? I didn't warn you about this intentionally.
You got this one.
The advice I tend to give on this one is that they should do whatever interests them, because everything else will become excruciating. So that's I really do believe it. That's first order. And I would have said they should do development, but you already said within development. So once that has been done, like within development is really whatever they feel excited about. And I also would say that to not be the current times are really difficult for PhD students, particularly PhD students who want to do development, anything in development, because they cannot even get to a developing country, they cannot run their survey, they cannot do anything. So my second piece of advice is to not get discouraged. That's going to pass, and then there'll be so much to do, and maybe the idea would be to use the time, if someone has not started, to write a good paper that does not involve collecting your own data, which I always advise people to do, because you need some sort of insurance anyway. So use this current time to do that, get it out of the way, and as soon as you get your vaccine and the plane reopen and the borders reopen, get yourself to developing countries anywhere you want, really, and spend some time looking around. Structured looking around usually involve working with other people or finding a foothold in a business or in a government or in an NGO or anything. Just I got so much, especially not being from a developing country originally, just being there. And then I think this question will answer itself, because somehow it will be so clear, like what, it's like, oh, how come nobody, told me this was happening? And that this is such a fascinating problem. I'm going to work on it.
Abhijit, let me pose to you the last question, given that we're running out of time. So I'm being asked by Prathna that women workforce participation has suffered immensely due to childcare and home care, and even the recent statistics in the US were very depressing in this regard. And Prathna wonders what are going to be the intergenerational effects of this impact on women. And also there are some concerns about domestic violence. And let me stress also, given a bit my work, that there is clear-cut evidence linking crisis and economic downturns with domestic violence in civil conflict more generally.
So it's a great question, and one that I wish we had more to say about, in the sense that I'm sure that you're right, that domestic violence, and there's some evidence showing that domestic violence went up during the COVID times. I think there is absolutely simple descriptive evidence suggesting that women were doing more childcare. Schools are, so I would say the first order has to be to reopen schools. It's extraordinarily costly, and while every other reform I would support, not reopening schools is a straight tax on women. And I think that's the sense in which I think if I had to prioritize one thing, I would go back to reopening schools and establishing, so the question of plumbing around that is important, establishing the protocols that make schools safe, when somebody's sick, what do you do, etc. Those are all important questions. We haven't really done much research on it, but I think I think there is some common sense there, and probably some experience from the US and other places where they've opened and closed and opened and closed. So I do think that there is some science that can underlie the reopening of schools. But if I had to pick one thing, I would say reopening schools is going to be critical. Then, of course, if the labor market continues to be down, women get displaced. It's well known that there's a pecking order of employment, so men will get the first jobs. So we need the labor market to revive. But I think first order, let's start by reopening schools.
Sure. Actually, I have been bombarded by many, many questions. So let me pose to Esther then the last question, which is about shared responsibility. So Nandini does, for example, and my great colleague, Elias Papaioannou, who works on corporate social responsibility, they are asking, is your idea of the Marshall Plan to go back to what we were before, or it's a bolder agenda to have a more common responsibility between emerging, low-income, and rich countries more generally?
Well, I think it would set a template for what is the role of the rich world with respect to the poor world, or to emerging market or to poorer countries. The way we are thinking about now is we are thinking about it as charities. Whenever we have time and whenever we have the energy and whenever our political stars are aligned and we have some aid budget and we are thinking of ourselves as maybe replacing a part of what the country should be doing themselves, or should be doing anyways. And that's like the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that these countries have very, competent people. Not all of them are equally benevolent, but that's equally true in rich countries, that not all leaders are equally benevolent. So we should stop looking down at poor countries and just looking at poor countries as countries that happen to be poor and therefore don't have the same capacity in the face of a crisis, and don't have the capacity in investing in sort of the venture capital of designing policies. And our development policy should be along these two lines, which is when there is a big crisis, we're there to help. When there is a need for and then there is always a need for innovation, we need to help finance that. And in particular, that becomes critical when we are thinking about climate change. I think we need to completely rethink the role and the responsibility of the rich countries vis-à-vis the rest of the world in the context of climate change, which is mostly produced in the poor countries and whose consequences are mostly felt in the poor countries.
Produced in the rich countries.
Produced in the rich countries, and where the consequences are mostly felt in the poor countries. And if we don't start thinking about what our so far pathetic behavior has shown during this crisis is that when there is a climate crisis, if we are not prepared for it, that's not when the rich world is going to suddenly wake up and do something for the countries that are the most affected. So we need to rethink that solidarity in this way. And the Marshall Plan is like a pilot, if you want, a template.
Sure. So, dear Esther and dear Abhijit, thanks big time for taking the time and being with us in this third flagship event of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. Actually, your work has been very inspiring for the setting up of the Institute. We come from a business school, but we think that there is more to be learned and actually apply insights from logistics that are relevant for development, among many other things, and from business practices more generally.